Welcome to PICT Voices, the interview series conducted by the faculty of the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking with notable members of the broader PICT community. Our goal is to present our community with a variety of voices across the spectrum of the humanities and critical creative thinking. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and today it is my pleasure to be joined by Peter Knight, Professor of American Studies at the University of Manchester. Hello, Peter, and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Well, Peter, I reached out to you to talk to you because one of your areas of expertise is conspiracy theories. Now, these theories have always been around, but lately they have become somewhat more present and a lot more vocal, at least. So I thought it good to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. Now, you also seem to be the perfect person to talk to, as your research into these theories did not start with this COVID-19 pandemic, but has gone on for a long time now. So you have a wider view on all of this, and this is obviously always more than welcome. Now, let's start with the basics. Although we probably all have an idea about what a conspiracy theory is, it might be good to delineate our playing field here and attempt to circumscribe or list some of the requirements needed for a theory to be considered as a conspiracy theory. Not all theories, in fact, can aspire to this appellation, and not even all alternative theories can either. So what does it take? What are the minimum requirements for a narrative to deserve the label of conspiracy theory?
Yeah, this turns out to be a harder question than it seems at first sight. So quite a lot of people working in this field take a fairly straightforward literal dictionary definition. You say, well, a conspiracy is an agreement of a group of actors in secret to carry out an evil plan, and a conspiracy theory is therefore an account of that. Now, although that's quite sensible in some ways, for me it doesn't really capture what is distinctive about a conspiracy theory as a very particular and quite fascinating way of making sense of historical causality. And it's important, therefore, to remember that this worldview, this way of understanding historical causality, has its own history. So although we might kind of say that conspiracy theories are visible there in ancient Greece and Rome, and certainly we can begin to see something that resembles conspiracy theory in the courts of Renaissance Europe, I think we would probably want to begin thinking about something that is recognizably a modern form of conspiracy theory with the French Revolution. But it's important to remember that understanding history as the result of conspiratorial intentions on the part of a small group of plotters was, at the time in the 18th century, not just a kind of a legitimate way of seeing the world, but actually a quite sophisticated, enlightened way of understanding historical causation as the product not of divine providence, but of individual human agency. Now, that way of understanding the world was normal, perhaps even sophisticated in the 18th century. But by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century, this way of understanding the world becomes stigmatized and even pathologized. And so we need to remember that the very term conspiracy theory really only gets to be used and defined in the middle of the 20th century, and it's the philosopher of science Karl Popper who famously develops a definition of the conspiracy theory of society, as he calls it, in the late 1940s. Now, I would define conspiracy theory, therefore, slightly differently to the dictionary definition, and instead point to the particular features that mark out this way of viewing the world as distinctive. And I think, there are three golden rules of a conspiracy theory. First is that nothing is as it seems. Appearances are deceptive. Second, and I think this is the most crucial, is that nothing happens by accident. So that everything that happens is the result of intentional, deliberate planning. And the third component is the idea that everything is connected. So you have those kind of three basic ideas, but increasingly there is a kind of fourth component that wasn't part of the worldview or the understanding of conspiracy theories in the 18th century, let's say, but is quite crucial now. And that's the idea that this way of seeing the world goes against received wisdom. And that is the thing that marks it out as distinctive today, and often that's the reason it becomes stigmatized and seen as pathological.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Now, for as much as not all theories this can fall under the denominator of conspiracy theory, I think that also not all events that occur invite or are prone to be surrounded by a similar conspiracy theory. So what does an event or an occurrence need for it to be worthy of being associated or have similar conspiracy theories fighting for its appropriation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question of whether there is something about a particular event that prompts us to think of it in terms of a conspiracy theory. I'm not sure whether that's the right way to think about the problem, though. So on the one hand, you can say, look, if we're right that conspiracy theories are a way of thinking about historical causality, a way of seeing history as the result, not of kind of, the random interaction of acts, intentions, as well as social and economic forces. If that's a way of thinking about the world that counts as a conspiracy theory, then the kinds of events that will get seen as a conspiracy theory need, by their very nature, to be something that can be seen as part of some kind of grand overarching plan. So rather than a particular small scale event here or there, it's the suggestion that what we're seeing is merely the tip of the iceberg. It might have just been what might have been an individual murder or catastrophic event, but the conspiracy theory will suggest that actually, no, this is part of some larger, vast, grand, overarching plan. So that's the way I would kind of suggest that conspiracy theory is seeing the world. It's not so much a particular event prompts people to see it in terms of conspiracy theory. It's that this worldview goes out looking for events that might be clues to an underlying plot.
Okay, so it's the theory that comes first, and then the events that are mashed up or are tried to be put into the puzzle to make it fix.
Yes. And when, I think in a moment we'll go on to talk about the current pandemic, and that's what I think is happening at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, we will obviously come to the pandemic today. We can't talk about anything else, it seems so. But not just now. Now that we have the basics clear, let's dig a little bit deeper and let's begin with the human aspect. Now, we generally view, at least I think we do, or better, to be more humble, I do, conspiracy theories as being mainly believed by some marginal loons, that is, people who we envision sitting at home, surrounded by various creams, reading all kind of weird stuff, and obviously wearing their typical tinfoil hat. What I have discovered, however, and it was this pandemic that made me discover this aspect, is that a lot of intelligent people, or people that I at least would consider intelligent, can fall for these theories. Anyway, what can you say about the people that find solace in these conspiracy theories?
So the data from social scientists shows that actually there is no one single identikit picture of a conspiracy theorist. I'm skeptical about some of those results, but in general, they show there is no clear difference between men and women, no clear difference between, in terms of kind of occupation, or in terms of right or left on the political spectrum, white or black, and so on. I think, though, there's actually kind of significant variety within the data. But what we also find is that actually conspiracy theories are now believed by a majority of people. If you give in questionnaires people a long list of conspiracy theories, the majority, and perhaps even virtually everyone, will agree to at least one of those conspiracy theories. So I think we need to begin with the idea that actually conspiracy theories are not some kind of weird fringe belief. They are quite mainstream now, and therefore we can't dismiss the people who believe them merely as kind of crazy people wearing tinfoil hats. Now, you asked the question, what's the solace that people find in conspiracy theories? Once again, I think there's no one answer that fits everyone, but we can kind of talk about a few generalizations. One is the idea that conspiracy theories provide a sense of coherence, a kind of overarching narrative explanation for everything that's going on. And looked at in the kind of longer historical perspective, we might say that actually conspiracy theories in that sense replace religion as a way of explaining how everything fits together.
Okay.
But at the same time, conspiracy theories in some ways, fail to understand what's going on because they see everything in terms of individual agency rather than kind of abstract social and economic structures. And so instead of seeing how society and historical events emerge from complex systems, instead they see everything as the result of individual intentions. Now, at the same time, conspiracy theorists today often identify themselves as being kind of, as not being gullible, that they are not the sheeple, they are not the kind of foolish people who just believe government propaganda. So there's this kind of attitude of world-weary cynicism, that you don't want to appear that you're being merely duped. And yet the irony is that often conspiracy theorists are the most gullible people. They're believing the stories that are most most implausible. Now, one of the interesting things about the demographic data about conspiracy theorists is, although in general there's not that much we can say because it's a majority phenomenon, there is a correlation between lower levels of education and tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. And that kind of makes us kind of wonder, well, is it merely that these people are kind of, ill-informed? I don't think that's the case. I think actually it's a more complicated connection between often people whose education levels are not as high. They tend to be the people who suffer the most from a sense of economic and social precarity and vulnerability. And it's that sense of the world being outside of your own control that I think is one of the main, not just psychological, but sociological drivers for belief in conspiracy theories. And then if we couple that with the crucial point that I want to make here, and that is that conspiracy theories are not a kind of crazy worldview that is completely unconnected with reality. Instead, I think we need to understand that conspiracy theories often express quite legitimate real world grievances, and increasingly they are an expression of genuine populist resentment and a sense of being left behind, both socially and economically, a sense of kind of status anxiety, and increasingly a distrust of technocratic elites. We see that with kind of Trump support in the US, but we also see it with the Gilets jaunes in France.
Yeah, and going a bit more deep into this, because and it's not just soulless, but there's also the attraction of why somebody could come in there. And in the research I did, there are a couple of reasons that people go or find these theories more interesting. And you already mentioned some of them. It's the fact of that it gives the overall information, the overall it rationalizes something that they might not understand. But another theory that's been proposed is that what lies at the basics of these theories is a distrust or a lack in the concept of truth. But something that I noticed, me personally, and that I found quite interesting, and I want to see how you react to this, is that also at times we are confronted. I think these conspiracy theories come before when people are confronted with other people who clearly don't seem to merit to be in a certain position, but instead of trying to do something against that, it could be easier to convince oneself that these meritless people are actually brilliant people who are there with a second plan. So in a certain sense, that these conspiracy theories, they could be considered as a paradoxical form of mental laziness, whereas the laziness is so paradoxical because it needs a lot of explanation. Does this make sense to you?
Yes, I think that's really quite plausible, that idea. So a couple of things I think we can note here. One of the ideas that really animates conspiracy theories is this this sense that actually we want history and current events to be the result not of kind of random complex interaction, but as the result of careful planning. Even if that careful planning is evil, there is still this kind of naive humanist faith that history is the product of individual intention and rationality. And that, on the one hand, so there's a cynicism and a distrust. There's a sense that everything we're being told is a lie, and yet at the same time there is this kind of strange naive faith that actually, if we can just get rid of the evil people pulling the strings, whether that's George Soros or Bill Gates at the moment, then the world can be made perfect. And you feel, to me, this has always been, such a kind of a fundamental misunderstanding. So on the one hand, there's this kind of, what's animating it is a desire to cling on to the notion that history is the product of individual agency. And you couple that with the idea of the expertise of the amateur. Often conspiracy theories are suggesting that the authorities and the so-called experts are lying to us, and that actually the only person I can really trust is myself. And my position as a conspiracy theorist is someone who is as an autodidact. I have learned these forms of kind of technological information, and that my knowledge is just as good, if not better, than the so-called authorities. So I think, the conspiracy theories come often from a quite genuine and legitimate place of political dissent, that I have a lot of sympathy with the idea that it's not that I am individually paranoid and seeing problems where there are none. It's the idea that actually the authorities are to be mistrusted quite often. There are good reasons why we might distrust political and even scientific authorities, but conspiracy theories suffer from the problem that they divert sensible, legitimate, slow, painstaking political activism and send us off on a wild goose chase, a kind of, a fantasy hope that by removing the imagined evil actors behind the scenes, we can regain some kind of just paradise on earth. That's just not true.
Yeah, I agree. And they seem to have a problem to accept mediocrity in positions of leadership when people are just incapable of finding a solution. Then it's as if they need to find, also in with scientists, not just political leaders, but also scientists can be really mediocre and they can't find a solution. So they tend to see them then as evil instead of not being able to find a solution. They have to be evil and they don't want to find a solution.
Yeah, one of the questions I try and ask conspiracy theorists when you're trying to kind of argue against them, which is, to be honest, most of the time a completely lost cause. But one of the questions you can ask them is, okay, so particularly if they work for a large organization, do you think that there are people at the top of your organization who are secretly, cleverly, cunningly planning everything in advance? Or do you tend to think that the people running your organization are a bunch of incompetent idiots? What do you think, are politicians geniuses, or actually are they idiots or kind of mediocre people who are often just making things up as they go along? And if you ask conspiracy theorists that, they tend to agree with you and say, oh, actually, yeah, when I think about my own organization or my own government. But of course, the irony is that conspiracy theorists say the people that we think are in power are merely the puppets of the real people behind the scenes who are the really clever, manipulative geniuses. And my argument is always that, well, if you think that actually the people that we see in power are incompetent, why would that not also be true of the people behind the scenes?
Yeah, exactly. And why would you in start a whole program of conquesting the world with a bunch of morons? Because I think that would be really difficult to do.
Yes,
anyway,
yes.
no, it's good that we have the same issues here. Anyway, so to leave the humanitarian aspect of conspiracy theories behind and enter a bit more into the technical and more difficult field of truth, two small questions that obviously remain in the realm of counterfactuals of the what if here, but that I think also need to be confronted though. So first is, if a conspiracy theory results in being true or real, can or should it then still be considered as a conspiracy theory, or are all these conspiracy theories necessarily false? But if they are false, isn't that then a problem for the whole category of conspiracy theories, not just for those who believe in them, but, and I think especially for those of us who don't? So that would be the first question. And the second then is what to do if the official theory, that is the official narrative of what is happening, if that turns out to be the conspiracy theory?
Yeah, these are two really important questions. So with regards to the first one, the problem that what happens if you label something a conspiracy theory and it turns out to be true. Now, if you just go for the straightforward dictionary definition, this, as I was suggesting at the beginning, I think that's the position you end up in, thinking, oh no, actually now I want to call it something else, not a conspiracy theory, but a conspiracy fact. I think that this is a mistaken way of thinking about the problem. And often, the kind of examples people talk about are, something like Watergate, was a conspiracy theory until it was shown to be true, and now we just call it history. But there are two important points here. One is the idea that at the time, we need to kind of work out whether people putting forward the theory had legitimate grounds for what they were saying, or whether their view would have been characterized by the definition that I gave at the beginning of a conspiracy theory, these characteristics that you're seeing everything that happens as the result of individual intentionality, you're seeing everything as part of a kind of vast interconnected plan, and you're seeing everything that happens as on the surface in the world as deceptive. If those things were true at the time, even if the theory then turns out to be true, I think we can still call that view a conspiracy theory, because it's a way of thinking about historical causality rather than just merely a theory of conspiracy. And I think that's the crucial thing. Now, as regards to your second question, what happens, if the official version of events is a conspiracy theory? I think this is a really important question because often when we're talking about conspiracy theories, we're assuming that we're talking about Western democracies. We're assuming the idea that actually conspiracy theories are a stigmatized way of viewing the world, that if officials, people in kind of positions of power, put forward conspiracy theories, they're going to be attacked and they're going to be ridiculed. But we need to recognize that in large parts of the world, and indeed in previous eras in history, it's the people in positions of power, authoritarian leaders who are using kind of populist resentment. They are often the people who are most associated with cynically, instrumentally using conspiracy theories to gain power and to maintain power. And I think we need to kind of recognize that these are two very different cases. We can still recognize them both as conspiracy theories, but we need to make sure that when we're talking about conspiracy theories, that we make a difference between, moon landing or flat Earth conspiracy theories in the West, which are kind of perfectly harmless, and forms of kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or conspiracy theories that are used against the public and repressive ways in other regimes around the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, turning to our pandemic and its relation to and cohabitation with the many conspiracy theories that we have seen coming about in recent times. Now, we started our conversation by delineating some fundamental elements of conspiracy theories and the events that are more prone or less prone to be associated with them. First of all, does the COVID crisis check all the required boxes, or is there something peculiar about it? And then secondly, is there something, if the answer to the last question, if there is something peculiar about it, then what are these peculiarities of the COVID conspiracy theories?
Yeah. So on the one hand, the COVID crisis has created a perfect storm for conspiracy theories. It's a kind of, a massive global event. It's genuinely frightening and confusing. We certainly in the early days didn't really understand that much about the disease and therefore what to do about it. It's produced, kind of massive social and economic effects in terms of lockdowns and economic devastation and personal devastation in terms of illnesses. And there's a lot of things that are genuinely kind of unknown and confusing. And therefore, like other kind of large global confusing events, it has led to conspiracy theories. It's also, I think, one of the things that has made it quite distinctive is the mismatch between what we're hearing from experts and authorities and our own personal experience. So on the one hand, we're being told, there's a massive global health crisis, and yet for many people, certainly in the early months of the pandemic, there was no evidence of it. You didn't know anyone who got sick. There was no sign on kind of a daily basis that anything was particularly different. And that mismatch between my everyday experience as an amateur expert versus what the government and the scientists are telling me has kind of produced a flood of conspiracy thinking. Now, the other reason why this has produced, the pandemic has produced a perfect storm for conspiracy theories is, in many ways, this is kind of, one of the first really major global events that's happened in the age of social media. I think
exactly.
That's been a game changer, not necessarily because it makes conspiracy theories any more popular than in the past. I think we need to be careful about that. But it's made them more visible and it's made them more available. Now, all of those things are true, but we need to recognize that conspiracy theories about the pandemic are entering into an already existing environment of populism in many locations around the world. Obviously, in the US with QAnon and Trump and the lead up to the elections, but in Britain with Brexit and anti-immigration sentiment, and in France with the Gilets jaunes and that sense of populist resentment against technocratic elites.
Now, let me conclude and address not the elephant, but the mammoth in our glass room here. And here it comes. Do you, who have researched conspiracy theories for a long time, do you think COVID-19 is a conspiracy? Have we all been the victim of Bill Gates and his goons, that is the Chinese bat-eating, virus-creating 5G imperialists?
Well, as much as I would like to reveal that, yes, it's all been a vast conspiracy, unfortunately, I don't think it has. It wouldn't surprise me if it turns out that actually the virus had escaped accidentally from the lab in Wuhan. I don't think that's going to turn out to be true, but it's not impossible. What's disappointing, though, is obviously the way that so many of the conspiracy theories turn to the usual suspects, not just Bill Gates, but often kind of George Soros, and there's the suggestion of anti-Semitism and kind of, right-wing extremism behind a lot of this. But here's the crucial point that I'd like to make. The real elephant in the room is not that there is some kind of vast conspiracy involving Bill Gates and bioweapons created by the Chinese or 5G companies. The real elephant in the room is, for example, why have we allowed the vaccination of the world's poor why have we had to rely on a billionaire philanthropist like Bill Gates? Or why is it that pharmaceutical companies receive massive state support in the form of university research, but make private profit? These, to me, seem the kind of, the big elephants in the room, the kind of questions that we should be asking, the kind of questions that the global pandemic is throwing up. Why is it that people of color in our societies have suffered disproportionately, both in terms of the disease and economic consequences? These are the real things that are happening and that people aren't asking sufficient questions about, but they are not the result of a secret, vast conspiracy. So on the one hand, conspiracy theorists are right to challenge the official version of events, but unfortunately, in doing so, often they are distracting us from these more legitimate and quite difficult political questions. Now, one final thing I just want to mention is that although, some of these conspiracy theories about the pandemic seem absolutely crazy, the idea that Bill Gates is planning to microchip us all with the vaccine, we need to remember, actually, once again, this is rooted in some kind of reality. There was research funded by the Gates Foundation into the possibility of vaccine delivery through patches with microscopic needles that would provide a record of vaccinations under the skin, and that this was explored by the Gates Foundation in order to get round one of the real problems of mass rollouts of vaccinations in the global south, and that is keeping accurate vaccination records in some of those countries. Now, that's real. It's interesting. But the way that the conspiracy theories latched onto that is so far divorced from reality that it distracts us from thinking through some of these larger questions about how do we do vaccine rollout, but also who should be responsible for these global health campaigns.
So instead of helping us to ask the real questions, they actually distract us from the real questions, taking us into a whole different field.
Yes. You know, their political desires for a better world are things that maybe we should share rather than just dismissing them as crazy tin foil hat wearing lunatics. But at the same time, we can't indulge them by saying, oh, you know, maybe you're onto something. We need to recognize that actually there are more important questions to be answered.
Okay. Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you for this highly enlightening view into conspiracy theories. And for all the people interested, if I'm not mistaken, you have recently started a blog on your research discoveries, you and your colleagues, at infodemic.eu. That's right. Am I right?
Yes, so that's our project at the moment, looking at conspiracy theories about the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, so people can continue following your findings in infodemic.eu. So thanks for this, Peter, again. And thanks also to our listeners for having joined us once again here at PICT Voices. And to you, dear listener, if you like our volunteer work here at PICT, you can now also consider supporting us by becoming an active member of our institution. For more information about how to join PICT, please visit our website. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and I thank you. Goodbye.